All right, so let's move to this issue. It is that Nedlac is now recommending mandatory vaccines in the workplace. The Labour Council holding its 26th summit in Johannesburg. Top of the agenda, of course, the vaccine mandates issue. Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi saying mandatory policies will depend on risk assessments. Heidi Giokos has been following that story. She joins us now for more. Hello, Heidi. So top of the agenda is whether Nedlac recommends vaccines becoming mandatory in the workplace. And tell us more.
Yes, indeed, Sally. So Nedlac has recommended that vaccines become mandatory in the workplace. Of course, this was a discussion that was held during the 26th Nedlac Summit. It's a conversation that's been on top of agenda, especially after the President announced that there was going to be a task team established to recommend possibly mandatory vaccines. We're also seeing how this has been happening in a large number of companies, MTN being the latest, Discovery, Standard Bank, and we also know UJ has recommended that vaccines become mandatory. So this is something that's top of the agenda. Of course, Employment and Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi announcing that this be recommended, especially in workplaces, and he made it very clear that it should definitely be done on a risk assessment basis. What does he mean by this? He means that especially where there's high risk, where there's high COVID-19 cases, it should definitely be considered and recommended that vaccines become mandatory. Why should vaccines become mandatory? Well, the science proves that it prevents against severe COVID-19 and possible death, which is of course what government is trying to avoid. Yes, there's a likelihood of reinfection even if you are vaccinated, but the chances of you getting very sick and possibly dying due to COVID-19 complications is a lot less if you've been vaccinated. So let's just listen in to what the Employment and Labour Minister had to say about that.
That the health and safety direction of the Department of Employment and Labour should be strengthened so that vaccination can become mandatory where a risk assessment at the workplace requires this. And I want to emphasize this part, or repeat it. The health and safety direction of the Department of Employment and Labour should be strengthened so that vaccination can become mandatory where a risk assessment at workplace requires this.
Heidi, I wonder if you could clarify COSATU's position. They have in the past said they are not too in favour of mandatory vaccines, but we did hear last week Matthew Parks of COSATU saying that they are in favour to move forward. What exactly is the Labour Federation saying?
So what's interesting, Sally, is that we approached the Labour Federation this morning. In fact, I actually reached out to Matthew Parks, who said that they were not in a position to speak about mandatory vaccinations, and we should rather speak to Martin Kingston from Business Unity South Africa. But then we saw the General Secretary, Bheki Nchali, coming on to speak at the Nedlac Summit right at the end, commenting on mandatory vaccines. And the message that came across, Sally, and we'll hear once that soundbite plays, is the fact that they are not pro-mandatory vaccines. They rather believe in persuasion and other ways in trying to get people to vaccinate. Now, this is a step back, or this is a U-turn in what they previously said, where they said they agree with mandatory vaccines. Now you're hearing the Labour Federation saying, well, in fact, we are not pro-mandatory vaccines. There should be other measures used to get people to vaccinate, such as persuasion, education around the vaccine, and also incentives, which we do know that the Department of Health, together with the Health Minister, of course, is already implementing. But it's clearly a change of heart. We're not entirely sure the reasoning behind this, but this also speaks, Sally, to the National Union of Mine Workers' stance on this. They released a statement today from their National Executive Council meeting saying that they are against mandatory vaccines, and they reject with contempt the fact that workers are unable to go to work without proof of vaccination. If they do go to work without proof of vaccination, they have to pay for their own PCR negative COVID tests, which of course is a huge burden on any individual to be paying for this kind of test every 7 days or so. So it seems as though Labour is having a different kind of conversation, whereas Nedlac is saying we're all seeing eye to eye with this, whereas the Labour Federation, COSATU, is saying we're actually not pro-mandatory vaccinations. But let's listen further to what COSATU had to say about this.
US Labour were opposed to to mandatory vaccination. We don't agree on that one. At least we agree to the ministerial directive that has been agreed and put in Nedlac. And in that ministerial direction, it gives a number of options as how these matters should be dealt with. We don't believe that you need to govern or by regulation, that every time you need to have a social compact with people. The first thing you need to think is to say what law we need to put in place to deal with those issues. We're saying this because we are quite aware of a number of sectors that are doing wonderful work in terms of engaging workers in the sectors that we're in. If you just look to the clothing and textile, almost about 70% of workers are vaccinated. If you look to education and health, you look to the mining sectors, much progress has been made. And what is the magic in this? There's no magic. Is that management has taken a view that working to the trade union, talking to people, we are able to make progress quicker than the question of trying to look to question of forcing people to be vaccinated. We all agree. And in fact, we have taken a view as Labour that at least 80% of our workers and their families should be vaccinated, and we're carrying that, talking to them. But just to go to say you are going to put law and force people to do, we don't think it's going to work.
And you know, Heidi, this is such a thorny issue, just displayed in the sort of differing viewpoints even within COSATU. Matthew Park saying last week that we've got to move forward. It's just taken too long to get enough people vaccinated. So it's a difficult one to get agreement on. But we do know as well that the President said that this issue has to be moved on. He set up a task team. So talk to me about how far discussions are and whether we might be heading for vaccine mandates early next year.
Well, Sally, if you have Nedlac coming out and saying that they recommend mandatory vaccines, it seems as though the discussion is advanced, I would say, and just hearing the kind of tone and the message that the President pushed when he addressed the nation was that the only tool that we have at this stage is to vaccinate. And just looking at what's happening globally, yes, many would argue, but there's reinfection, there's a new variant, but where are we in terms of reinfection? It's a lot milder this time around. Yes, data is still very new, but it seems as though vaccination has worked against almost every single variant that has emerged because of COVID-19. So we understand that there might be a decision as early as next year, January. We are almost in the middle of December. So the President is, of course, discussing with the various bodies and stakeholders. But the President made it very clear, Sally, that we need to find a way to live with this virus. And it seems as though it's going to be around for some time, unfortunately. And if there is something like a vaccine that can provide some kind of protection, especially against severe disease and death, then that is something that they will have to consider. But it does become an issue of many saying, well, it's my constitutional right not to get the vaccine. It's my constitutional right to opt not to get the vaccine. But science proves otherwise, and science says that it does protect you. And of course, this is something that the President will have to consider. Interestingly enough, though, Sally, that when we interviewed the Employment and Labour Minister after he presented his keynote address, he did say that he prefers persuasion rather than forcing people to do it, and it will probably head to the court because it's such a contentious issue.
Yeah, and we also know that I think it's Busa who's seeking a declaratory order in the High Court currently on this issue. Thank you so much, Heidi Giokos. And I guess it does depend as well on how the fourth wave plays out here in South Africa. If we have another devastating wave of infection and death, that might change minds somewhat. Thank you very much, Heidi Giokos.